Hello, and welcome to the Residence Academy. Today, we are talking about habits, our habits. Habits of thought, habits of behavior, how we get them, and why they're so hard to change. I bet you all remember when seatbelts just were not standard in cars, and then all of a sudden they were. So what was it like for you to learn to put that seatbelt on, for that to become a habit? Well, habits tend to become part of us in a couple of different ways. One is by just repeating it now and then, often enough that after a while it becomes kind of natural. And that's probably what happened with the seatbelts. Maybe somebody bugged you about it. Or a habit can get implanted in our brain because we have a particular strong experience, maybe with a lot of emotion attached to it. For me, that's how seatbelts got into my brain. This was back in 1968, a little while ago, yes. It was the summer between my undergraduate and graduate work, and I had subleased an apartment from one of the faculty members who was going to Europe, and a car came with it. Well, this was the first time I had a car on a daily basis, and that was pretty exciting. So one day I was at the gas station and getting gas, and of course back then somebody pumped your gas, right? And I happened to look over, and there was a car sitting kind of over to the side of the gas station, and it was a little smushed in the front, and it had two distinct holes in the windshield. I said to the guy pumping my gas, "What happened to that car?" He said, "Well, it was in an accident, but it wasn't all that serious of an accident, but the two people in the front were pitched forward and their heads went through the windshield, and they both died." Wow. He said, "I don't think if they'd had seatbelts on, they would have even gotten hurt." Well, this impressed me. I reached over at that point and I put my seatbelt on. And pretty much from that day forward, I started wearing my seatbelt. Today, I wouldn't even imagine going across the parking lot without the seatbelt on because it wouldn't feel right, and it's so automatic. So that's how our habits come about. Habits have been an aspect of human behavior that's been a fascination for centuries. 19th century French psychologist and philosopher Léon Dumont describes habits this way: "They are our tendency to form unconscious behavioral patterns, to learn an action, sometimes link it to a whole series of actions, and then repeat it again and again and again and again." Dumont goes on to say, "We do not so much direct our own actions as we become shaped by them." That's an interesting to think about. We become shaped by our actions. Since Dumont's observations, research has confirmed that 90% of our thoughts and behaviors occur at a level of unconsciousness, completely outside of our awareness. Think of conscious and unconscious behavior as being like an iceberg, with a small amount, the conscious part, being above the waterline, and the bigger amount, much bigger, the unconscious, being below the waterline. Certainly in the last couple of months of living with the coronavirus, we have been required to be much more conscious of our habits, bringing up an awful lot of those unconscious things from the lower part of the iceberg to the upper part of the iceberg, where we've had to modify them. Things like touching our face, washing our hands, figuring out what we can do and when we can do it. All of these have been major changes in our unconscious habits. I saw an example on the news one day of just how hard this is to change. This was kind of early on in the corona situation, and it was a report by the Director of Health for the state of Washington. And at that point, Washington State was the epicenter for the cases of coronavirus in the United States. She came on and she talked about how important it was when you're out in public not to touch your mouth, your nose, or your eyes. And then she went to turn the page in her presentation, and she touched her tongue with her finger to wet it to turn the page. Here was a person who was trying to help us make changes in our habits, and yet this was a habit so unconscious that she didn't even realize that she was doing it. And this happens to all of us. So why is it necessary that most of what we do and think is in the bottom of the iceberg? Well, let's take a look at how we function in contrast to other animals. Animals kind of below our level of development. Animals in that category function primarily from what is hardwired at birth. These are called instincts, and the simpler the animal, the more dependent he is on his instincts. Most animals, even one-cell animals for instance, are capable of modifying their behavior in response to experience. We call that learning. But for the most part, instincts rule. Humans, on the other hand, due to their highly developed cerebral cortex, up here, gain most of our behavior through learning. But over time and repetition, they're performed without our awareness. Take, for instance, going back to the example of a car, for instance. Think about what it was like when you first learned to drive a car. Everything that you did, you had to learn step by step and be very conscious of it. But as you did it over and over and over again, pretty soon it became less and less conscious and more automatic. As a series of behaviors are learned, like starting up a car and adjusting the mirrors, adjusting the seat, so on and so forth, and they're repeated, they are put into what we would call a bundle or a package, and they're performed in a related sequence. Now, why is this? Because it's much more efficient and requires less energy, and it frees up our attention if all of this sequence or bundle gets put into a place where we don't have to pay so much attention to it. Once it's bundled, the package is downloaded into our subconscious, into the bottom of that iceberg. This happens equally well for behaviors that we label as good behaviors and the ones that we don't like so much, the bad behaviors. These patterns of related behaviors are tied to events in the environment, and also our thoughts are tied to events in the environment that are called triggers. These triggers activate the bundle. When a bundle is completed, when we've done the whole sequence, our brain gives us a little zap of something called dopamine, which you've heard of before. This is the feel-good chemical that reinforces the maintenance of that sequence of behaviors. Another good example of that would be smoking. If you've ever been a smoker, or you know somebody who has been a smoker, you know that it's not just inhaling on a cigarette. There's a whole ritual that goes with it. It's taking the pack out and opening it and getting the cigarette and getting the lighter and lighting up and drawing on it and finding the ashtray and so on and so forth. There's a lot to smoking. These bundles can be simple behaviors such as nail biting, saying thank you, or complex behaviors like smoking, or ones that feel like they're kind of a part of who we are, such as procrastination, or a tendency to be frugal, or the opposite of that, spending outside of our means all the time. These behaviors can be things like being very tidy, eating patterns, exercise habits, and much more of our everyday life. Patterns are learned, rehearsed, bundled, stored, and produced automatically. They are hard, but not impossible to change, thanks to something called neuroplasticity, the ability of our brain to wire and unwire in response to our experience. And what does that process is repetition. According to Jeffrey Kluger, writer for Time and author of How Habits Make or Break Us, one approach to changing bad habits or unwanted habits and developing preferred ones is to establish something called a keystone habit. Fundamental goal or objective that encourages the development of lesser habits that can be bundled with the keystone. An example would be, let's say at some point in the past you decided that when you retired you wanted to have a home in Florida. Well, what was that going to take? It was going to take saving money. So maybe you altered some of your behaviors. Maybe you were more conscious of having to pay fees on your credit card. Maybe you put a little bit of money away each week or each month toward this goal. But you did things that, these other kinds of habits that you developed that came along with the keystone habit of this goal of I'm going to be able to buy a house in Florida that I can go to in the winter when I retire. And maybe something that's a little more likely in our population these days, let's say you want to be able to walk better. Maybe you're having trouble walking and your doctor has said, gee, if you lose weight and if you get exercise, how many of us have heard that, huh? That you could get more strength and be able to walk better. So you set that as the keystone. It's not the eating, it's not the exercise per se that you focus on, is what is it I want to accomplish? What's the bigger goal? And the goal is I want to be able to walk more effectively, more easily.